They say nature doesn't play favorites, that it takes what it wants and leaves no room for sentiment. But out in the snowy hills of western Montana, there's a place where that rule doesn't seem to apply, where a bobcat, a wild, untamed predator by any measure, spends his days curled around a vegetable like it holds the meaning of life. A fennel bulb, cradled gently between powerful paws. Not shredded, not chewed, just held, like a memory, like something too fragile to let go of. Some say he guards it, others say he mourns it. But those who've seen him up close, really seen him, know it's something else, something deeper, something about love, maybe, or the things we cling to when the world doesn't make sense anymore. He doesn't have a name out there, not one that he responds to. But the caretakers at the sanctuary call him Asher. He came to them broken years ago, carried through a snowstorm by an old woman with trembling hands and a scarf that still smells like cedarwood and tea leaves. Her name was Evelyn, and she never missed a Saturday. For nearly 3 years, she sat on the same wooden bench outside Asher's enclosure, always with a fresh fennel bulb in her lap. Sometimes she'd hum. Sometimes she'd just sit in silence, eyes half closed, as if she were waiting for something to come undone inside her. And Asher? He'd watch her. Never from far, never from fear. Always with this stillness that made the wind seem louder. He'd approach, slow and deliberate, and press his nose to the mesh between them. Then he'd take the fennel, gently, respectfully, and carry it back to his bed of cedar shavings and worn blankets like it was something holy. No one could explain it. Not the veterinarians, not the behaviorists, not even Nora, the sanctuary director with 20 years of experience and a notebook full of unusual cases. "He doesn't act like a bobcat," she'd whispered once, after watching him bathe a fennel bulb as if it might feel pain. "It's like he remembers something, or someone." But what could a wild animal remember? What could it possibly grieve? The real story, the one nobody told in full, began 2 winters before the first fennel ever entered the picture. It began in the early gray of morning, when the frost clung to pine needles like breath, and Evelyn's hands were still steady enough to hold a coffee mug without spilling. That morning, she heard a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not branches, not the usual shuffle of deer or the call of a raven. No, this was smaller. A whimper, broken and rhythmic, like the ticking of something that had almost run out. She stepped out in her slippers, barely dressed, drawn by something she couldn't name. The gravel was stiff under her feet, the cold curling into her bones like old regret. And there, just beyond the woodpile, she found him. A kitten. Spotted, bloodied, no bigger than a folded towel. His body shook with every breath, his eyes sealed shut, one side matted with something too dark to be dirt. Evelyn didn't think. Didn't weigh the odds or wonder why a bobcat would be lying in her driveway. She just moved. Quick. Careful. She grabbed an old wool blanket from the back of her truck, the one she hadn't used since Robert died, and wrapped the little body in its faded plaid. "You don't get to quit today," she whispered, her voice cracking around the cold. "Not on my watch." She drove fast, one hand on the wheel, the other holding the bundle on the passenger seat. Every now and then she'd glance down, watching for the rise and fall of breath. Once it stopped. Just for a moment, just long enough to make her forget how to breathe herself. By the time she reached the clinic in Helena, her knuckles were white, her throat raw from whispering to something that couldn't answer. And that's where the rest of the story begins. Dr. Leland Turner had seen plenty in his 35 years as a wildlife vet. Snared coyotes, poisoned eagles, even a mountain lion hit by a snowplow. But when Evelyn burst into his clinic cradling a wool blanket like it held a newborn, something in his chest tightened. He peeled back the fabric gently, revealing the battered bobcat kitten. His expression hardened with concern. Puncture wounds, likely from a raptor. Talons had raked across the tiny body, leaving angry red slashes and deep bruises, a small fracture along the hind leg. internal bleeding likely, and something else. Something in the way the kitten's head tilted, his body limp and unresponsive to sudden movement. "It's not just physical," Leland murmured. "There may be brain trauma." Evelyn didn't flinch. "Do what you can. I'm not leaving until he's warm and breathing steady." For hours, the clinic buzzed with low murmurs and cautious precision. Leland worked in silence, flanked by 2 assistants. The overhead light buzzed faintly as fluids were administered, wounds cleaned, pain managed. They weren't fixing a bobcat. They were resurrecting a spark. When Leland finally stepped into the waiting room, Evelyn was sitting upright, her fingers twisted tightly around the hem of her coat. She didn't stand when he approached. She just looked up, dry-eyed, jaw set. "He made it through the worst," Leland said quietly. "But Evelyn, even if he pulls through, the damage to his nervous system, he's not going back into the wild." Her voice was calm, final. "I'm not asking for miracles. I just want him to have a chance." Leland nodded slowly. "Then he needs more than I can give here. There's a place west of the Bitterroots, private sanctuary, run by a woman named Nora. She takes in cases like this, predators that can't go back, but still deserve a life." Evelyn didn't ask for a phone number, didn't ask for directions. She just said, "Call her." By nightfall, a blue pickup rolled into the clinic parking lot. Nora stepped out, wiry, wind-chapped, hair tucked under a knitted beanie. Her eyes scanned the kitten briefly, but it was Evelyn she looked at longest. "You found him?" Evelyn nodded. Nora studied her for a moment, then extended a hand. "Then we owe you something." They didn't say much else, just loaded the kitten into a modified carrier lined with heated pads and soft towels, the old wool blanket tucked in beside him. As the truck door shut and the engine rumbled to life, Evelyn placed a hand on the metal. "Tell him." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind. Just make sure he knows someone wanted him to live." Nora nodded once, then drove into the snow-glow dark, the kitten nestled in quiet beneath layers of warmth and fading blood. That night, Evelyn sat alone on her porch, wrapped in Robert's old parka, watching the tree line. She didn't know the bobcat's name, didn't even know if he'd make it through the week. But a strange feeling settled in her chest, something heavy and hopeful all at once. It felt like the beginning of something unfinished. And miles away, as the truck wound through the mountains, the little bobcat slept for the first time, without pain. The sanctuary sat on a ridge just above where the Flathead River cut through stone and pine. From the outside, it looked like an old ranger station, rebuilt and expanded with hands that knew the weight of winter. Wind snapped at the metal siding. The trees creaked, but the place pulsed with quiet purpose. Nora didn't speak much as she carried the crate inside. The bobcat, still unnamed, was silent, his breath shallow but present. She placed the carrier in a warm room with a sloped roof and faded green tiles. Soft, instrumental music played through speakers overhead, an old habit from her years working with injured foxes. Music calmed fear, or so she hoped. Over the next days, Nora charted his progress like clockwork. Fluids, antibiotics, bottle feeding every 3 hours. When his eyes finally opened, she saw the amber hue, clouded at first, then slowly sharpening like thawing ice. But the behaviors weren't right. She'd raised enough wild cats to know what to expect. Cubs of his age should be swiping at moving shadows, practicing pounce and pin with their bedding, testing their little jaws on prey substitutes. He did none of that. Instead, he'd stare at nothing for minutes at a time. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, sometimes comically off-kilter. Once, while attempting to bat a feather wand, he missed entirely and rolled off his heated mat, landing in a flurry of fur and confusion. Rather than yowl or hiss, he just blinked and purred. "Well, you're not like the others," Nora whispered, watching him crawl into a laundry basket filled with old towels. She documented everything. Slow reflexes, poor coordination, no hunting instinct, an unusual affection for textures, soft ones. He had a favorite, a faded sock she kept forgetting to throw out. He'd wrap himself around it like a pup with a comfort toy. Days turned into weeks, and with every small milestone, holding his bottle without help, climbing onto a perch without falling, recognizing her voice, Nora felt something shift. He wasn't improving the way wild animals needed to. One chilly morning, after recording his lack of prey response for the 4th time, she stepped out into the courtyard where her assistant, Julian, was laying straw in the fox run. "He's not going to make it out there," she said softly. Julian paused, then looked up. "You mean, ever?" Nora nodded. There was silence for a beat. Then Julian asked, "So what now?" She watched a raven land on the fence line, its feathers ruffled by the breeze. "Now we figure out what kind of life he can live in here." That afternoon, she walked back into the kitten's room and sat beside his crate. He blinked at her, one paw resting on the sock. "I guess you need a name," she murmured. He tilted his head, pupils wide and unafraid. "Asher," she said at last, "means blessed, or ash tree. Something that bends but doesn't break." Asher yawned. A soft, soundless motion, followed by a stretch and a slow blink. It wasn't a name he recognized, of course, but somehow it fit. And outside, as the sky began to spill orange behind the mountains, Evelyn sat by her fireplace, staring at the old wool blanket folded on the arm of her chair, wondering what had become of the little life she'd let go. Spring melted into summer slowly that year, as if Montana itself was reluctant to let go of the cold. Asher had grown larger, his legs now gangly, his paws comically oversized, and his fur thicker and dusted with gold around the ears. But his spirit, it was still lopsided, still beautifully wrong in all the ways that wildness wasn't supposed to be. Nora had moved him into a transitional enclosure, a half-inside, half-out shelter where he could stretch, climb, and explore under supervision. Most bobcats at that stage would start displaying territorial behavior, stalking shadows, attacking feed, marking every post like their lives depended on it. Asher did none of that. He climbed, yes, but clumsily, often missing branches and landing in a heap, only to roll over and blink in a daze. He chewed on bark, not out of aggression, but seemingly curiosity. His prey drive was nearly absent. When presented with a training dummy filled with rabbit scent, he pawed at it like a confused toddler meeting a toy he didn't know how to play with. What he loved, above all else, were soft things. Towels, stuffed animals, Nora's gardening gloves. But his favorite by far was an old rubber boot one of the interns had left near the fence. Asher dragged it into his den like a dragon hoarding treasure. He groomed it, curled up around it, even tried to sleep with his nose pressed into its side. Julian once joked, "He's either deeply broken or the world's weirdest minimalist." Nora didn't laugh. "No," she said softly, watching Asher roll onto his back and kick the boot gently with his hind legs. "He's just wired differently. Doesn't mean he's broken." She had stopped referring to Asher as a case by then. He wasn't a file in her ledger or a rehab subject with a prognosis. He was Asher, plain and strange and full of little contradictions. It was during one of the early harvest deliveries that something changed. Nora was unloading crates from a local farm co-op, donated produce meant for the omnivores and herbivores under her care. Carrots, squash, apples, and fennel. A bulb rolled from the edge of the box and landed near Asher's enclosure. He was on his perch, grooming his shoulder lazily, but the moment the fennel thumped onto the grass, his head snapped toward it. He climbed down slowly, curious. Approached the bulb with slow, deliberate steps. Nora, watching from behind the fence, expected him to sniff and lose interest. Instead, Asher did something that stunned her. He leaned down, nuzzled the fennel, then carefully picked it up in his mouth. Delicate, no puncture marks. He carried it across the enclosure like a mother transporting her cub. Then he settled onto his blanket, placed the bulb beneath his chin, and closed his eyes. No chewing, no shredding, just holding. For a full hour, Nora didn't move. She sat on the ground outside the enclosure, not daring to speak, not even to take a photo. Something sacred was unfolding, something tender and unexplainable. That night, she wrote in her journal, "He's not missing wildness. He's found something else, something quieter." The next morning, she called Evelyn. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Nora smiled. "He's still here, still different. But Evelyn, you won't believe what he's fallen in love with." There was a pause. "What?" Evelyn asked. "Fennel." Silence, then laughter, soft, rich, and disbelieving. "Fennel?" "Yeah. He treats it like, I don't even know. A friend, a memory, something sacred." Evelyn didn't reply for a moment. Then quietly, "Maybe he remembers kindness." Nora didn't understand it then. Not fully. But the next Saturday, Evelyn showed up for the first time in over a year, with a fennel bulb tucked gently into a canvas tote, and a look in her eyes that said she hadn't forgotten a thing. Evelyn arrived just after sunrise, when the dew still clung to the edges of the grass, and the forest was whispering in birdsong. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, and her late husband's old flannel jacket, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists. In her hands, a small brown tote. Inside it, nestled like something precious, lay a single, fresh fennel bulb. She stood quietly at the edge of the sanctuary, unsure whether to announce herself. But she didn't have to. Asher had already noticed. From the far corner of his enclosure, he stood on his hind legs, pressing his paws to the mesh, making a low, warbling chirp. Nora, sipping her coffee on the porch steps, looked up and smiled. "He remembers," she called gently. "Come on in." Evelyn walked slowly, as if unsure whether the ground might shift beneath her. Her eyes welled slightly as she stepped closer to the fence. Asher chirped again, then dropped to all fours, pacing along the edge as she approached. "Hey there, wild heart," she whispered, kneeling. She didn't try to reach through the wire. She just placed the fennel down gently in front of her and leaned back, letting the air settle between them. Asher stared at the bulb for a long moment. Then, with careful deliberation, he reached through the gap in the fence, hooked it gently with one claw, and pulled it toward him. He didn't bite it, didn't shred it. He carried it like a memory, like it meant something only he understood. And then he curled around it, resting his chin atop its pale green stalks, and blinked slowly, once, then again. Evelyn stayed there for hours. Nora brought her tea and a folding chair. They talked quietly, about nothing at all, while Asher slept with his fennel beneath the shade of his favorite tree. That visit became a ritual. Every Saturday morning, Evelyn would arrive with a tote full of fennel. Some weeks it was just one bulb. Others, when the farmer's market was generous, she brought 3 or 4. She always sat on the same bench. Asher always greeted her. It wasn't just the fennel. He knew her. He watched her like no other visitor, pressed his face to the fence when she spoke, groomed himself meticulously while she sipped tea and read aloud from her weather-worn novel. Once, she brought an old scarf, faded rose with tiny birds embroidered near the ends, and left it draped over the fence post when she departed. The next morning, the staff found it in Asher's den, nestled next to his fennel stash, untouched but clearly moved. Nora installed a bench near the enclosure, just for Evelyn. A soft wooden thing with iron arms and a plaque that read, "For quiet moments and wild hearts." It wasn't long before others noticed. Nora posted a short video of Asher cuddling his fennel to the sanctuary's website, expecting maybe a few local shares. Instead, it exploded. Millions watched. Comments flooded in. "This is the gentlest thing I've seen all year. I've never cried over a vegetable before. The way he holds it, it's like he's protecting something fragile." Asher became a symbol of softness, of survival through gentleness, of healing without claws. Evelyn laughed when Nora told her about the viral video. "I always knew he had a bit of showman in him," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "Just needed the right stage." But it wasn't the views or the comments that mattered most. It was what came next. The sanctuary started getting letters, handwritten ones, from places like Nebraska, Ontario, Asheville, and somewhere in the hills of Vermont. People who had seen the video or heard the podcast, writing in about how they cried watching Asher curl around his fennel like it was the last good thing in the world. A woman from Oregon wrote, "My husband passed last year. I haven't been able to hold anything of his without falling apart until I saw Asher. Now I keep his flannel on the couch, just like before." A little girl from Boise sent a drawing, crayon and marker on construction paper, of Asher sitting beneath a tree, surrounded by fennel. Above it, in block letters, "He's not scary, he's safe." Evelyn read every letter Nora saved. Some made her laugh. Others made her wipe her glasses for no reason at all. She never expected what came next. It started with the local senior center. A few women from Evelyn's bridge club had begun following Asher's story online. After seeing his video, they came up with an idea. They called it Fennel Fridays. Every week, a group of retirees pooled their pension pennies and ordered organic fennel from the town's farmers market. One by one, they'd pack the bulbs into repurposed apple boxes, sometimes decorating them with drawings or little notes. Each Friday morning, like clockwork, the boxes arrived at the sanctuary's gate. Some had tags. For Asher, "Keep cuddling." Others had small poems taped to the side. One read, "He does not roar, he does not bite, but oh, how bravely he holds the light." Asher greeted the deliveries like ritual. He'd chirp and pace at the gate, eyes locked on the box as Nora carried it in. And when the enclosure door clicked shut behind her, he'd approach, select a bulb with exaggerated care, and trot off with it in his mouth like he'd won a prize. He never chose the biggest, always the one that looked right. And always, he'd place it on his blanket, curl around it, groom it, and fall asleep with it pressed beneath his chin. Local kids started getting involved. A third-grade class painted fennel patterns on clay pots to raise money. A nearby diner added a fennel-stuffed grilled cheese to the menu, the Asher Melt, with proceeds going to the sanctuary. Evelyn stood back and watched it all unfold like a dream she'd forgotten to have. A tiny, broken life she'd wrapped in a wool blanket had grown into something that made strangers from across the country cry into their coffee. And through it all, Asher never changed. Still gentle. Still quiet. Still choosing one bulb over the others, tucking it away into his favorite sleeping spot, like a dragon guarding joy. Nora often said, "It's not the fennel he loves, it's the feeling, the safety, the memory." Evelyn wasn't so sure. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the sun began to slant golden through the trees, she'd sit on her bench and talk softly to the air. "You remember the blanket, don't you?" she'd murmur. "The way it smelled, the way it held you together." And sometimes, just sometimes, Asher would rise from his bed, stretch long and slow, and come rest by the fence. Silent, still, together. The grant came in late September, buried in a stack of mail Nora nearly forgot to open. It was from the Callahan Foundation, an organization known for quietly funding conservation programs across North America. Attached was a short letter. "We saw Asher's story. We believe animals like him deserve sanctuary and purpose. Please use this funding to expand your work." The check was real and substantial, enough to build a dedicated enclosure wing for unreleasable wildlife with neurological conditions. Bobcats, foxes, maybe even a bear one day. Animals who didn't fit nature's mold but still had value, still deserved love and dignity. They called it the Asher Wing. Construction began that fall, just as the trees began shedding their fire-colored leaves. The local news picked it up. School groups came to visit. Some brought fennel instead of flowers. Evelyn watched it all from her bench, hands tucked into her coat, scarf wrapped tight. "He's a teacher now," she whispered one morning, as Asher stretched across a pile of straw, a fennel bulb balanced comically on his belly. Funny how that works. But beneath the joy and growing legacy, something had started to shift in Evelyn. Her steps grew slower. Her fingers, once deft and strong, began trembling when she held her tea. The hill to the sanctuary bench became harder to climb each week, even with Nora's help. She never said anything, not directly. But Nora knew. So did Asher. He'd begun behaving differently, more alert when she arrived, more still. Sometimes he'd pace near the gate even before she pulled into the gravel drive, and on the days she didn't come, when weather or fatigue kept her home, he sulked, refused food, slept curled around the scarf instead of his fennel. It was subtle, quiet, but it was grief before the loss. One afternoon, Evelyn brought him a fennel bulb that was oddly shaped, curved like a crescent moon. Asher took it, turned it over in his mouth, and placed it beside the scarf with almost ceremonial care. He didn't play that day. He just lay still, one paw resting over both objects, his breath slow and shallow, as if bracing for something that hadn't yet arrived. That night, Nora sat on the porch long after dark, the stars blinking like forgotten promises. She held her journal in her lap, pen motionless. Inside the enclosure, Asher let out a sound she'd never heard before. Not a growl, not a chirp, a low, aching hum, like wind moving through hollow things. And somewhere beyond the pines, Evelyn sat alone by her fire, pressing her hand to her chest and whispering to no one at all. "I know, sweetheart. I feel it too." The first snow fell early that year. It came quietly overnight, soft as a whisper, blanketing the sanctuary grounds in white. Nora awoke to the silence, that peculiar kind of hush that only fresh snowfall brings. The whole world muffled, stilled, reverent. She walked out to Asher's enclosure before the others arrived. The frost hadn't reached the fennel cache yet. Those precious bulbs tucked neatly under logs and straw, like secrets kept safe for winter. Asher was awake, sitting perfectly still in the center of his space. He didn't turn to greet her. His eyes were fixed on the bench. Empty. Evelyn hadn't come the week before, or the one before that. A letter had arrived instead. Handwritten. The same looping cursive that had once penned notes in the margins of donated fennel boxes. It was short. "My legs don't carry me like they used to, but please tell him I'm still thinking of him. I keep the window open in the mornings just in case he sends a dream my way." Nora had cried quietly after reading it. She placed a copy of the letter in Asher's folder. Then she tucked the original into a mason jar and left it by the gate. That morning she opened his enclosure and placed one of Evelyn's last fennel bulbs beside the scarf that still smelled faintly of bergamot and cedar. Asher didn't move, didn't chirp. He only looked at her, eyes wide and unreadable. Then, slowly, he stood. With deliberate grace, he picked up the bulb and carried it. Not to his bed, but to the fence. He set it down gently, then pressed his forehead to the mesh. Nora knelt across from him, throat tight. "I know," she whispered. "She misses you too." Later that week, the call came. Evelyn had passed in her sleep. "Peaceful," the nurse said. Like she'd just curled up beside someone she trusted and let go. Nora drove out the next day, scarf wrapped around her throat. She brought fennel. Not for Asher. For Evelyn. She left the bulb on the windowsill of Evelyn's cottage, beside a photograph of her and her late husband standing on the porch long before the Bobcat ever arrived. Back at the sanctuary, Nora sat beside the fire, not speaking. And in the enclosure, Asher gathered his bulbs, one by one, and carried them into a corner of his den. He arranged them into a soft circle. Then he curled in the middle, the scarf draped across his back like a blanket. That night, he didn't purr. He didn't sleep. He simply stayed still, keeping vigil, remembering the hands that once held him and whispered, "You don't get to quit today," and promising, without words, that he wouldn't. Winter settled deep into the valley. The wind grew sharper, the nights longer, and a hush seemed to fall over the sanctuary, as though the land itself was grieving. Nora noticed changes in Asher, subtle but unmistakable. He became quieter, not just in sound but in spirit. Still attentive, still affectionate in his own way. But the spark that once lit up his every step dimmed. He no longer greeted visitors with chirps. He no longer paced eagerly at the scent of fresh fennel. He still accepted them, gently as ever. But his ritual had shifted. Now he chose just one bulb and carried it to the bench where Evelyn used to sit. He'd place it on the ground in front of the fence, press his nose to the post she'd always leaned against, then walk away. Every week, without fail. Julian called it the offering. Nora didn't correct him. One morning in late January, she found something unexpected. On the inside wall of Asher's den, near his bed, was a pile, neatly arranged, a fennel bulb, the faded scarf, and lying beside them, something she hadn't seen in years, the old wool blanket Evelyn had first wrapped him in. He must have pulled it from the supply shed where they kept retired linens. No one knew how he got it. But there it was, threadbare, dusty, frayed at the edges, and unmistakably hers. Asher had dragged it into the heart of his world, and he'd lain down upon it like a crown. Nora sat in the straw beside his enclosure that day, heart aching. The wind carried birdsong through the trees, thin and reedy, as though even nature was mourning softly. "I don't know how you remember," she whispered. "But you do." That evening, after the visitors had gone, she lit a lantern and placed it on the bench. No plaque, no sign, just light. A quiet glow for those who kept vigil. And as dusk settled, Asher rose from his bed, stretched, and padded slowly to the fence. He sat beneath the lantern, eyes half closed, and lifted his head to the sky. Snowflakes landed silently on his fur. He didn't move, didn't blink, just breathed. And somewhere in that stillness, the memory of Evelyn sat beside him, not as sorrow, but as warmth, as promise, as the sound of old boots in fresh snow, approaching softly, never quite arriving, but always there. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, testing the air with warmer mornings, coaxing the first green buds from the frozen soil. By mid-April, the sanctuary paths were dry again, and the birds returned in full chorus. Asher changed with the season. Not back to the kitten he had been, not wild, not clumsy, not quite so playful, but something new, something steadier. He still chose his fennel, still slept with the scarf, still carried the wool blanket from sun to shade depending on the day. But now, he also greeted Nora again. He'd meet her at the gate most mornings, letting out a low chirp, brushing against the fence before retreating to his perch. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't sadness. It felt like acknowledgement, a shared breath between two creatures who had carried loss and come through the quiet. The sanctuary had grown. More animals arrived, foxes with fractured legs, a young raccoon who couldn't see well enough to survive on her own. The Asher wing filled slowly, intentionally, with lives that bent instead of broke. Visitors still came to see him. Some brought fennel, others brought letters. One man, gray-bearded and heavy-set, knelt by the fence and whispered, "You got me through a year I didn't think I'd survive." Asher blinked slowly and pressed his paw to the mesh. On the first anniversary of Evelyn's passing, Nora held a small gathering. Just the staff, a few locals, and the bridge ladies who still mailed fennel every month. They placed a single bulb on the bench. No words. Asher came to the fence as dusk settled. He sat still for a moment, then stood, turned slowly, and walked back to his den, returning with the oldest fennel bulb in his stash, wilted but intact. He laid it gently next to the new one. 2 bulbs, side by side. And then he lay down beside them, slow and graceful, resting his head over both. The group stood silent, not daring to move. Nora exhaled. "I used to think success meant releasing them back into the wild," she said softly. "But maybe sometimes it means giving them a place to be exactly who they are." The lantern flickered as the breeze picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and the faintest trace of fennel. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Asher closed his eyes and purred. Not loud, not for show. Just enough to say, "I remember. I am still here. And I was loved." In that moment, beneath the blooming sky, a wild heart slept peacefully beside the memory of a woman who once whispered, "You don't get to quit today." And he never did.